Before we begin, listen closely. There are stories the church preserved and stories hell tried to erase. Tonight, you're about to hear one of them. So before we go any further, make sure you subscribe to this channel, click the notification bell, and stay with me until the end, because stories like this don't just fade into history, they echo. And as always, leave a comment while you're watching. Tell me how far these videos reach. Tell me where you're listening from, and how this story makes you feel. Your comments tell me this voice is being heard. Now, let's begin. She was not supposed to speak. That was the unspoken rule of her time. Women prayed, they obeyed, they stayed silent. Especially women locked behind monastery walls. Especially women born sickly, fragile, and unwanted. Especially women who claimed to hear voices that did not belong to this world. And yet, in the cold hills of medieval Germany, a woman would rise whose voice demons themselves tried to silence. Her name was Hildegard of Bingen. She would become a prophet, a composer, a healer, a theologian. But before history crowned her with titles, something else noticed her first. Something dark, something ancient, something that did not want her to speak. Hildegard was born in 1098, the 10th child of a noble family. In those days, the 10th child was often considered a tithe, an offering to God. From the moment she could walk, her fate was sealed. She would belong to the church, whether she wanted to or not. But even as a child, something was wrong. She saw things other children didn't. Light without a source, shapes moving behind walls, voices whispering not in dreams, but in waking hours. She would later write that as early as age 3, a fiery light entered her mind, filling her entire vision. Not blinding, illuminating, not chaotic, ordered, and yet terrifying, because alongside that light were shadows. She learned quickly to stay silent. In medieval Europe, visions were dangerous. Saints were rare. Heretics were common, and the line between them was thin enough to slit a throat. So she endured in silence. At the age of 8, Hildegard was enclosed in a monastery cell. The world closed in. Stone walls, cold air, endless prayers, days without color, nights without sound, except the ones that came for her. She would later describe those nights without drama, without exaggeration, which makes them more disturbing. She did not say demons appeared with horns and fire. She said they came as pressure, a weight on the chest, a tightening of the skull, a voice that did not shout, but pressed. Be quiet. You are mistaken. No one will believe you. The whispers didn't tempt her into sin. They didn't offer pleasure. They did something far worse. They tried to erase her voice. Years passed. Hildegard grew frail, frequently ill, plagued by paralysis like weakness that would leave her bedridden for weeks. Modern scholars would later speculate about migraines, neurological disorders, psychosomatic illness. But Hildegard herself knew the truth. Every time she resisted writing down what she saw, her body collapsed. Every time she tried to obey the silence imposed on her, the visions intensified, and the voices changed. What began as whispers became accusations. If you speak, you will be destroyed. If you write, you will be mocked. If you reveal what you see, you will lose everything. This was not imagination. This was opposition. In 1141, at the age of 42, the pressure reached its breaking point. During prayer, the familiar blazing light returned, but this time it did not hover. It commanded. She heard a voice, not threatening, not violent, but absolute. Write what you see and hear. Hildegard resisted. She begged. She wept. She argued with God, terrified of ridicule, condemnation, and worse, damnation. And that's when the darkness pushed back harder than ever before. She fell violently ill, unable to move, unable to speak. Her body twisted in pain, so severe the nuns believed she was dying. Hildegard would later say the illness lifted only when she agreed, out loud, to obey. The moment she took up the pen, the pain receded. But the resistance did not. As she began writing Civias, Know the Ways, her first visionary work, the attacks intensified. She described sudden waves of despair that had no emotional cause, thoughts that did not feel like her own, a crushing certainty that she was lying, deceived, damned. At night, shadows would gather at the edges of her cell. Not figures, not bodies, absence, places where light refused to enter. And from those places came the same message, again and again, stop. Hildegard did not scream. She did not dramatize. She wrote anyway. That may be the most terrifying part. She described demons not as grotesque monsters, but as forces of distortion, entities that twisted truth just enough to paralyze the soul. They did not roar. They undermined. And they hated one thing above all else: that her words were being recorded. Once written, they could not be erased. Word of her visions spread slowly, then uncontrollably. Church authorities became uneasy. A woman claiming divine visions was a theological risk. A woman describing demonic resistance was worse. Investigations followed. Clergy observed her, tested her orthodoxy, watched for madness. And yet, they found nothing false. Even Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most powerful churchmen of the age, reviewed her writings and supported her. That decision would seal her fate, because once the church acknowledged her voice, hell had lost its silence. Hildegard later wrote that the opposition grew more desperate after approval came from Rome. She experienced waking visions of grotesque forms collapsing when named, shadows recoiling when scripture was spoken aloud, a sensation of being watched, not by one presence, but many. She described demons as furious not because she was holy, but because she was obedient. They rage when the human voice speaks what they wish buried. And Hildegard spoke anyway. By the time Hildegard of Bingen's writings reached Rome, the silence around her life was gone. And silence, as she would soon learn, was the one thing the darkness preferred above all else. The approval of church authorities did not bring peace. It brought escalation, because now, what she wrote was no longer private suffering. It was dangerous testimony. Hildegard described her visions as waking experiences, never dreams, never trances. Her eyes were open. Her mind was clear. The world remained visible beneath the visions, as if reality itself had been peeled back. And within those visions, the enemy changed tactics. The whispers stopped pretending to be internal thoughts. They began addressing her directly, not by name at first, but by function. You interfere. You expose. You disrupt the order we maintain. She wrote that the voices were cold, not emotional, not angry in the human sense, but irritated, like something disturbed from long sleep. At night, Hildegard began waking with the sensation that something had entered the room before she opened her eyes. Not footsteps, not sound, presence. The air would feel thick, like breathing through cloth. Candles flickered without wind. Shadows clung to corners unnaturally, stretching longer than the walls allowed. She did not describe faces. She described pressure, a sense of compression around her thoughts, as if something were trying to squeeze her mind shut. And always, the same objective: do not continue. Her physical suffering returned with violence. Seizure-like tremors, sudden blindness lasting hours. Her body would lock, her muscles rigid, her breath shallow. The sisters believed she was dying more than once. But Hildegard noticed something terrifying. The symptoms worsened only when she delayed writing. When she obeyed, when she recorded what she saw, the pain receded. It was not punishment. It was resistance. In one vision, she saw what she described as a vast dark form stretched across the world. Not a creature, but a corruption. It wrapped around cities, monasteries, churches. Where it touched, truth bent slightly. Just enough. She saw figures clinging to it. Entities without stable shape, feeding on distortion, thriving where confusion ruled. And then she saw herself. Small, fragile, standing alone. And yet, speaking. The moment her voice rose, the form recoiled. Not destroyed, but wounded. That was when the attacks became personal. She began experiencing intrusive images, not sinful fantasies, but blasphemies. Sacred symbols twisting, scripture inverted, prayers disrupted by sudden violent imagery. She did not hide this in her writings. She confessed it openly. The enemy does not always seduce with pleasure. Sometimes it defiles what you love, so you will abandon it. These thoughts horrified her, not because they tempted her, but because they assaulted her devotion. And the more she prayed, the more aggressive the interference became. Hildegard also reported something even more disturbing. There were moments, brief, terrifying moments, when the visions fell silent. No light, no voice, no presence of God, only emptiness. And in that emptiness came the most dangerous suggestion of all: you are alone. She wrote that this silence felt worse than any pain, worse than illness, worse than fear, because silence made her doubt. Church officials noticed the toll. Visitors described Hildegard as glowing with intensity one moment, collapsed in exhaustion the next. Some believed her visions were killing her. Others feared they were proof of possession rather than sanctity. Accusations followed. Was she deceived? Was she delusional? Was this truly divine? Hildegard knew the darkness watched these doubts closely. Division was one of its favorite tools. In response, the attack sharpened. She recorded a vision of demonic figures mocking her weakness, not with laughter, but with certainty. They did not threaten hellfire. They predicted irrelevance. Your words will fade. Your body will fail. Your voice will be forgotten. History itself was the battlefield. But Hildegard did something unexpected. She sang, in the middle of illness, in the middle of terror, in the middle of doubt. Music, she wrote, fractured the pressure. The voices recoiled when sound filled the space. Not just any sound, but ordered harmony. She believed music reminded creation of its original alignment. Demons hated order. They thrived in distortion. And her music cut through them like light through fog. As her reputation grew, so did the intensity of opposition. She began publicly preaching, an unheard of act for a woman of her time. Each sermon was followed by exhaustion so severe she could not move for days. She wrote that after one sermon, she felt surrounded by unseen observers, watching, waiting, measuring, not to attack, to learn. That realization chilled her more than fear ever had. By the end of this period, Hildegard understood something crucial. The darkness was no longer trying to stop her entirely. It was adapting, learning how far it could push without silencing her, learning how to wound without killing, learning how to wait. There comes a moment in every true spiritual battle when the enemy stops pretending. For Hildegard of Bingen, that moment arrived not with a scream, but with clarity so sharp it felt like a blade. She realized the darkness no longer wanted her silent. It wanted her exhausted. By the time she reached her late 50s, Hildegard's body was failing. Years of visions, fasting, illness, and constant resistance had left her fragile. Her hands shook when she wrote. Her sight blurred. Her voice weakened. And that was when the visions changed shape. The light that once flooded her mind now arrived surrounded by resistance, like sunlight forced through smoke. Every revelation came with immediate backlash, crushing fatigue, vertigo, and an overwhelming sense of being pulled apart. She described it as standing between two opposing currents, one lifting, one tearing, and neither would let go. In one of her most terrifying visions, Hildegard saw the human soul as a luminous structure, intricate, ordered, alive. Around it swarmed dark forms, striking not to destroy, but to disorganize. They attacked memory. They attacked meaning. They attacked identity. They do not need to kill the body if they can fracture the will. She understood then why so many people fell without ever committing obvious evil. They were worn down. The attacks became physical in ways she struggled to describe. Sudden choking sensations during prayer, an invisible force pressing her head into the floor. Moments when her tongue felt locked, unable to speak sacred words. Once, while dictating a vision, she felt her voice cut off mid-sentence, as if the air itself refused to carry sound. She later wrote, "It was as though something placed its hand over my mouth, not violently, but firmly, insisting." Fear crept in, not fear of demons, but fear of failure. What if she stopped? What if her body gave out before the work was finished? What if silence finally won? That fear became the darkness's most effective weapon. It whispered not threats, but concern. Rest. You have done enough. Let others carry this burden. And for the first time, Hildegard wanted to listen. Her breaking point came during a prolonged illness that left her bedridden for months. She could barely lift her head. Her visions dimmed. The light flickered. And in that weakened state, she experienced the most disturbing vision of all. No monsters, no shadows, no pressure, just a vast, empty quiet. And within it, a voice, not hostile, not mocking, but gentle. "You may stop now." The offer felt merciful, and that terrified her. Hildegard realized then the ultimate danger was not suffering. It was relief, because relief would mean abandonment of the task. She wrote later that resisting this temptation took more strength than resisting pain ever had. And the darkness responded, violently. Her next vision shattered her composure. She saw herself standing before a distorted figure, neither human nor beast, its form unstable, collapsing and reforming. It accused her not of heresy, but of arrogance. Who are you to speak? Who granted you authority? Why should your voice matter? The accusations struck deeper than any physical attack. They echoed doubts she had never voiced. But then something unexpected happened. She spoke back, not loudly, not angrily. She simply spoke the truth of what she had been given. And the figure recoiled, not in pain, but in disintegration. It unraveled, not defeated by force, but undone by coherence. That moment changed everything. From then on, Hildegard understood the nature of the war. This was not a battle of strength. It was a battle of order versus distortion, truth versus erosion. And her role was not to overpower darkness, but to refuse to let it scramble what was given. The attacks did not stop, but they lost their precision. The choking returned, but passed quickly. The whispers continued, but weakened. The silence came again, but no longer convinced her. She had crossed a threshold. However, the cost was high. Her health never recovered. She lived in near constant pain, aware that each vision shortened her life. But she accepted this with terrifying calm. The body is the ink. The soul is the script. In the end, the darkness did not come roaring. It came wearing authority. After decades of visions, illness, resistance, and relentless obedience, Hildegard of Bingen was not dragged into a cave, nor surrounded by screaming demons. She was summoned, politely, by the very institution that had once protected her. And this time, the silence was official. The incident seemed small. A single burial. A man who had died under the shadow of excommunication. Church law was clear. His body did not belong in consecrated ground. His soul, they said, was unresolved. Dangerous. Contaminating. But Hildegard said otherwise. She claimed she had seen the truth in vision, that the man had reconciled with God before death, that mercy had arrived unseen, unheard, but real. The authorities demanded compliance. Dig up the body. Erase the mistake. Hildegard refused. Not loudly, not rebelliously. She simply said no. That refusal triggered something far more terrifying than any demonic attack she had endured. The interdict. Her monastery was placed under spiritual lockdown. The sacraments were withdrawn. The mass silenced. Confession forbidden. The bells stilled. And most painfully of all, music was banned. For Hildegard, this was not symbolic punishment. It was surgical. Music had always been her defense. Harmony against distortion. Sound against collapse. Order against the slow decay of meaning. She believed, knew, that music aligned the soul with its original structure, that it drove disorder away not through force, but through coherence. And now, coherence was stripped from her world. The chapel became a hollow shell. Prayers moved silently, like mouths underwater. Days stretched unnaturally long, and the darkness returned. Hildegard wrote that the silence felt wrong, as though creation itself was holding its breath. Without music, the monastery felt porous, like something could slip through unseen. The pressure returned to her chest. The whispers came back, not frantic this time, but patient, satisfied. This is how it ends. Not with fire, with obedience. They reminded her that demons had failed where authority succeeded. Her health collapsed rapidly. She could no longer walk without being carried. Her hands shook uncontrollably. Her vision blurred so badly she struggled to recognize faces. Pain radiated through her body without warning, leaving her gasping, clawing at the bed linens. Sleep offered no relief. She described waking visions where the light flickered weakly, barely holding back encroaching darkness. The certainty she once carried felt distant, like a memory that belonged to another woman. And then came the worst sensation of all, abandonment. For the first time in her life, Hildegard questioned whether obedience had finally required her silence. Not because she doubted God, but because God was quiet. No commanding voice, no blazing clarity, no reassurance, just endurance. And the darkness took advantage of that vacuum. The whispers changed tone. They were no longer hostile. They were reasonable. You are old. You are tired. Let the world move on. They suggested she had misunderstood her role, that her task had ended long ago, and that persistence now was pride, not faith. This was the most dangerous moment of her life, because part of her wanted to agree. Yet even in that hollowed-out state, Hildegard noticed something unsettling. The silence was not neutral. It was occupied. The longer music was absent, the heavier the air became. The sisters reported unexplained dread, intrusive despair, sudden fits of weeping without cause. The monastery did not feel punished. It felt infected. And Hildegard understood. This was what the darkness had always wanted. Not her destruction, her removal. Unable to sing, unable to preach, barely able to move. She did the only thing still allowed. She wrote. Letters flowed from her cell like blood from a wound. She addressed bishops, abbots, archbishops, her words stripped of ornament, sharpened by suffering. She did not accuse. She warned. When harmony is suppressed, disorder enters quietly. What you call discipline may become erosion. Her letters carried something deeper than authority. They carried clarity born of pain. Time dragged on. Months passed in enforced silence. Hildegard's body deteriorated so badly that some believed she would die before any judgment was reversed. The darkness seemed confident now, present, but no longer aggressive. It waited, and then something shifted. Church authorities reopened the case. They reviewed her visions again, not casually, but thoroughly. They compared her words across decades. They examined her theology, her obedience, her consistency, and what they found disturbed them. No contradiction, no distortion, no corruption, just a voice that had remained aligned through suffering. The interdict was lifted. Music returned, and when the first note was sung again inside the monastery, Hildegard wept, not with joy, but with exhaustion so deep it bordered on grief. Because she understood what had almost happened. Her final months were quiet, but not peaceful. Her body continued to fail. Breathing became shallow, movement painful, vision dim. But the darkness no longer pressed in. It had lost leverage. Her last visions were gentle, not triumphant, but resolved. She described light no longer opposed, no longer strained. Not victory, completion. Hildegard of Bingen died in 1179. Not in glory, not in spectacle, but intact. Her voice was preserved. Her words endured. Her music still sings centuries later. And the silence that tried to finish her failed. Here is the truth that lingers long after this story ends. The darkness does not always come as terror. Sometimes it comes as permission to stop. And the bravest resistance is not loud defiance. It is continuing anyway.